$10,000 for one night with your giant Apache wife. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fresh wound. Every person on that dusty street stopped breathing at exactly the same moment. Because when a man in a $1,000 suit stands in the middle of town holding a bag of money with a dollar sign painted on it, making an offer like that, one of two things happens. Either blood spills in the next 30 seconds, or something far worse unfolds. What nobody understood yet was that Silas Kemper had spent 3 years learning a different language than violence, and what Cornelius Blackwell was about to discover would cost him more than money ever could buy back. The sun beat down on the town's main street, with the kind of heat that made men's shirts stick to their backs and turned the ground into something that felt like walking on the surface of a stove. Silas had come into town that morning for supplies, nothing more. Flour, salt, ammunition for hunting, maybe some fabric Nahimana had mentioned needing for a new shirt. Simple errands that should have taken an hour, and sent them back to their ranch before the worst heat settled in. Nahimana walked beside him the way she always did, not behind him like some of the townspeople expected, not ahead of him like she was trying to prove something. Beside him, equal. Her presence turned heads not because she was Apache, though that was reason enough in a place where most people had never spoken to a native person in their lives. Heads turned because Nahimana stood taller than most men in town, with shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of physical work that would break lesser people. Her braids reached past her waist, woven with small turquoise stones that caught the light when she moved. She wore traditional clothing that showed her heritage with pride, never attempting to hide who she was or where she came from. Silas had learned early in their marriage that the stairs never bothered her. What bothered her was disrespect. There was a difference between curiosity and contempt, and Nahimana could spot contempt from 100 yards away. They had just stepped out of the general store when Cornelius Blackwell made his entrance. He arrived in a carriage that cost more than most families in town would see in 5 years of hard labor. The door opened, and he stepped down onto the street in his fine black suit, polished shoes that had never seen a day of real work, and a smile that suggested he believed the entire world existed for his entertainment. Silas recognized the type immediately. Rich men came through frontier towns regularly, looking to buy land, exploit resources, or simply amuse themselves with the locals before returning to their comfortable lives back east. They rarely stayed long, and Silas had learned the best strategy was to simply avoid them until they left. But Blackwell had spotted them. More specifically, he had spotted Nahimana. He walked directly toward them with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. 2 men in slightly less expensive suits followed behind him, carrying themselves like guards or hired muscle. When Blackwell got within 10 feet, he stopped and removed his hat, with an exaggerated flourish that might have been meant as respectful, but came across as mocking. "My goodness," he said, his voice carrying across the street loud enough for everyone to hear. "You must be the famous couple I've been hearing about. The rancher who married the savage." The word landed like a slap. Nahimana's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing. Silas felt his own muscles tense, but he forced himself to remain calm. Men like Blackwell wanted a reaction. They fed on it. "We're just here for supplies," Silas said evenly. "We'll be on our way." "Oh, but I haven't made my offer yet." Blackwell reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather bag. He opened it to reveal stacks of crisp bills. $10,000. More money than you'll see in your entire life working that pathetic ranch of yours. He held the bag out toward Silas, his smile widening. "All I want is one night with your wife." The street went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Silas felt every eye in town turn toward them, waiting to see what would happen next. His hand moved slowly toward his side, fingers brushing against something in his pocket. And that's when Nahimana laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a genuine, amused laugh that seemed to confuse Blackwell more than any threat could have. She looked at Silas with an expression that said she had dealt with men like this her entire life, and they had always underestimated what that mistake would cost them. But before she could speak, Silas's hand closed around whatever he had been reaching for in his pocket. He pulled it out slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone watching could see exactly what came next, because what happened in the following minutes would determine whether they could ever show their faces in this town again, or whether Cornelius Blackwell would be the one who needed to leave and never come back. Silas pulled a worn leather pouch from his pocket. Not a weapon, not a knife, just a small bag that looked like it had seen years of use. The kind of thing a man might carry personal items in. He held it up so Blackwell could see it clearly, then opened it and poured the contents into his palm. Coins. Maybe 30 or 40 of them. Silver pieces mixed with copper. The kind of money a working man accumulated slowly over months of hard labor. The total value probably added up to less than $50. Silas held his hand out flat, letting the coins catch the sunlight. "This is everything I had when I asked Nahimana to marry me," he said quietly. $43.16. I offered it to her father, knowing it wasn't nearly enough by any standard. Knowing that in her tribe, a man was expected to bring horses, weapons, valuable goods to prove he could provide for a wife. The crowd had grown larger. People were coming out of buildings now, sensing something significant was happening. Blackwell's smug expression had shifted slightly, though he was clearly trying to maintain his superior attitude. Silas continued, his voice steady and calm. "Her father looked at those coins for a long time. Then he looked at me, and he asked me one question. He asked if I knew what those coins meant in his culture, if I understood that by offering money, I was treating his daughter like property that could be purchased." Nahimana stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but something in her eyes suggested she knew exactly where this was going. She had heard this story before, but hearing it told publicly was different. "I told him I didn't know," Silas said. "I told him I was ignorant of his customs, that I'd grown up in a world where everything had a price attached to it, and I was ashamed to realize I had insulted him and his daughter both. I asked him to teach me the right way, the respectful way." Silas closed his hand around the coins, then looked directly at Blackwell. "He said there was no bride price, that his daughter was not for sale at any amount, that if she chose to marry me, it would be because she saw something in me worth building a life with, not because I could afford her." The words hung in the air like a judgment. Blackwell's face had started to redden, though whether from anger or embarrassment was hard to tell. "So I kept these coins," Silas said, "as a reminder that the most valuable thing in my life was given to me freely, out of choice and respect, not because I had enough money to purchase it." He poured the coins back into the pouch and returned it to his pocket. Then he looked at Blackwell's bag of money with something that might have been pity. "You can't buy her for $10,000, Silas said. "You can't buy her for $1 million, because she's not for sale. She never was. She chose me, and that choice is worth more than anything you could ever offer." The silence that followed was absolute. People who had been watching with morbid curiosity were now watching with something closer to respect. Blackwell's two men shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond to a situation that involved no violence, but somehow felt more dangerous than any gunfight. Blackwell's face had gone from red to almost purple. His hand tightened on the money bag until his knuckles turned white. Men like him were not accustomed to being lectured by people they considered beneath them. They were not used to being made to look foolish in front of crowds, and they especially did not appreciate being given moral lessons by ranchers who lived in modest homes and worked with their hands. "You think you're clever," Blackwell said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think this little speech makes you better than me." He stepped closer, close enough that Silas could smell the expensive cologne the man wore, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly wages. "But I see what you really are. You're a man who took an opportunity, who saw a savage woman that nobody else wanted and decided to make her your property by wrapping it up in pretty words about choice and respect." Nahimana's posture changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in her weight, a slight adjustment in how she held her shoulders. Anyone who knew her would recognize it as the movement a predator makes right before it strikes. And suddenly, the real question wasn't what Silas would do. It was what Nahimana would allow to happen before she ended this herself. Nahimana had been silent through the entire exchange, standing beside Silas with the patience of someone who had survived far worse insults than anything Cornelius Blackwell could deliver. But there was a difference between patience and submission, and anyone who mistook one for the other was about to learn a very expensive lesson. She stepped forward, not aggressively, not with any obvious threat. She simply moved into the space between Silas and Blackwell, with the kind of confidence that made grown men reconsider their choices. Up close, the difference in physical presence became even more apparent. Blackwell was a tall man by most standards, but Nahimana stood eye to eye with him, and where he had the soft build of someone who had never missed a meal or worked a hard day, she had the lean muscle of a warrior who had been training since childhood. "You called me a savage," she said. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried across the street in a way that made everyone lean in to hear. Twice now. Once when you arrived, and again just now. Blackwell opened his mouth to respond, but Nahimana continued as if he had not tried to speak at all. In my language, there is no word that translates exactly to savage. The closest we have means something like one who has not yet learned the proper way to be human. We use it for children who are still learning, for outsiders who do not yet understand our customs, for people who act without wisdom or respect. She tilted her head slightly, studying Blackwell the way someone might examine an interesting but ultimately disappointing specimen. By that definition, you are the savage here, not me. The crowd had grown larger still. Word was spreading through town that something significant was happening on the main street, and people were abandoning their daily tasks to witness it. A few of the older townspeople looked uncomfortable, as if they knew this situation was spiraling into territory that might have lasting consequences. Blackwell's face had progressed beyond purple towards something closer to crimson. His jaw worked as if he was chewing on words too angry to release properly. One of his men put a hand on his shoulder, clearly trying to suggest they should leave, but Blackwell shrugged it off violently. I don't need to stand here and be lectured by some woman who should be grateful any civilized man would even look at her, Blackwell snarled. You want to know the truth? I didn't come here to make a genuine offer. I came here to prove a point, to show everyone in this pathetic little town that everything and everyone has a price, that all your high-minded talk about respect and choice is just poverty disguised as virtue. He gestured broadly at the crowd, his voice rising. Any one of you would take this money if I offered it for the right thing. Your land, your horses, your dignity, all of it for sale if the price is high enough. That's what civilization is. Understanding that everything is a transaction. Nahimana smiled then, not a friendly smile, not even an amused smile. It was the kind of smile a person gives when they have just realized their opponent has revealed a fatal weakness. You are right about one thing, she said. This is a transaction, but not the kind you think. She reached down to her belt and slowly, deliberately, pulled something free. A knife, not a decorative piece, not something meant for show. This was a working blade, the kind used for hunting, for survival, for protection when necessary. The handle was wrapped in leather that had been worn smooth by years of use. The blade itself was perhaps 8 inches long, perfectly maintained, sharp enough to catch the light in a way that made several people in the crowd take an involuntary step backward. Nahimana held the knife loosely in her right hand, not in a threatening position, but in a way that suggested she knew exactly how to use it if circumstances required. Blackwell's eyes went wide, and both of his men immediately reached for weapons concealed under their coats. But Nahimana was not looking at them. She was looking at Silas, and there was a question in her eyes. A question that asked whether he trusted her, whether he understood what she was about to do, whether he would stand with her or try to stop her. Silas met her gaze and gave the smallest nod. Whatever came next, they were in it together. Nahimana turned her attention back to Blackwell, who had gone very still, very quickly. His bravado from moments before had evaporated the instant he realized he might actually be in physical danger. His men had their hands on their weapons, but had not drawn them, clearly uncertain whether drawing on an Apache woman in the middle of a crowded street was a situation they wanted to be involved in. You want to buy something from me? Nahimana asked. Then let me make you a counteroffer. Nahimana held the knife in a way that suggested she had held it 1,000 times before, not like someone trying to intimidate, like someone who understood that a tool was only as useful as the person wielding it, and she was extremely useful when circumstances required. You say everything has a price, Nahimana said to Blackwell, that all things can be bought and sold. So let me offer you a trade. She gestured to the bag of money still clutched in Blackwell's white-knuckled grip. Keep your $10,000. I do not want it. I do not need it. What I want from you is something far more valuable, something you clearly have never given to anyone in your entire life. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be worth remembering. Blackwell tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes kept flickering to the knife, to Nahimana's steady hand, to his own men who seemed increasingly uncertain about their employer's choices. I want your respect, Nahimana said simply. Not your money, not your approval. Your genuine respect for me as a person who has as much right to exist in this world as you do, who has as much value, who makes her own choices about her own life. She took a single step closer to Blackwell, who involuntarily took a step back. His heel caught on the edge of the wooden sidewalk, and he stumbled slightly, catching himself, but losing even more dignity in the process. "But you cannot give me that, can you?" Nahimana continued. "Because you have never respected anyone in your life. Not your workers, not the people in this town, not even yourself. You measure everything in money because that is the only language you speak, the only value you understand." She turned the knife slowly in her hand, examining it as if seeing it for the first time. "My father gave me this knife when I completed my first solo hunt. I was 13 years old. It took me 3 days to track a deer through terrain that would have killed most grown men. When I returned with the meat, my father did not praise me. He did not tell me I had done well. He simply handed me this knife and said it was now mine to keep." Nahimana looked back at Blackwell, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was something other than anger or contempt in her expression. There was genuine curiosity, as if she was trying to understand how a person could live so long and learn so little. That knife was worth maybe $2 in trade value, but it meant more to me than anything else I owned, because it represented something I had earned through effort and skill, something given to me by someone I respected, who respected me in return. She held the knife out toward Blackwell, handle first, offering it to him. "I will trade you this knife for your bag of money," she said. "Not because I want your money, but to prove a point, to show everyone here what the difference is between value and price, between something earned and something bought." Blackwell stared at the offered knife as if it might bite him. His mind was clearly working through the trap he sensed but could not quite identify. If he took the trade, he would be admitting that a $2 knife was worth $10,000, making him look foolish. If he refused the trade, he would be admitting that not everything could be bought, contradicting his entire worldview. "This is absurd," he finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "You expect me to trade $10,000 for a knife?" "No," Nahimana said calmly. "I expect you to understand that you cannot trade $10,000 for this knife, because this knife is not for sale, just like I am not for sale. Just like the respect and love between me and my husband is not for sale. Some things exist outside your world of transactions and purchases." She lowered the knife and returned it to her belt in one smooth motion. "You came here to prove that everything has a price. Instead, you have proven that you cannot recognize value when it stands directly in front of you, that you are so trapped in your own small understanding of the world that you cannot see beyond money to the things that actually matter." The crowd was completely silent. Several people were nodding slowly, as if pieces were falling into place in their minds. Even Blackwell's own men were looking at their employer with expressions that suggested they were reassessing their employment choices. Blackwell's face had gone through so many color changes that he now looked almost pale. His hand shook slightly as he held the money bag, and when he spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "You think you have won something here," he said quietly. "You think you have made me look foolish, but I will remember this, both of you, and there are consequences for embarrassing men like me." That was when the sheriff stepped forward from the crowd. Sheriff Warren Hayes was a man who had seen enough conflict in his years to recognize when a situation was about to cross from words into violence. He moved through the crowd with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that rushing would only escalate tension, but delay might allow things to spiral beyond control. He was older than most people in town, with gray threading through his hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many difficult decisions. He had been sheriff for almost 20 years, and in that time he had learned that the law was less about absolute right and wrong than about keeping people from killing each other over disputes that would seem trivial a week later. But he had also learned that some disputes were not trivial at all. Some were about fundamental questions of human dignity that would define what kind of town this was going to be. "Mr. Blackwell," Hayes said, his tone neutral and professional, "I think it might be time for you to move along. You have made your offer. It has been declined. Continuing this conversation serves no purpose." Blackwell turned to face the sheriff with an expression that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment. The fear and uncertainty that had crossed his face during Nahimana's response vanished, replaced by the confident smirk of a man who believed he held all the real power in any room he entered. "Sheriff," Blackwell said warmly, as if they were old friends meeting by chance, "I am glad you are here. I was hoping to speak with you about a business matter. You see, I am considering purchasing some property in this area. Significant property. The kind of investment that would bring jobs and money to your town." The implication hung in the air like smoke, Blackwell was offering a bribe without actually saying the words. He was suggesting that his continued business interest in the town depended on how this situation was resolved, that if the sheriff sided with Silas and Nahimana, there would be economic consequences for the entire community. Hayes had dealt with men like Blackwell before, men who believed their wealth gave them the right to operate outside the boundaries that governed ordinary people, men who saw the law as something that could be bought or negotiated rather than something that applied equally to everyone. "The property market is not my concern," Hayes said evenly. "Keeping the peace is, and right now you are disturbing that peace." Blackwell's smile tightened. "I made a legitimate business offer. If it offended anyone, I apologize. But surely there is no law against making an offer, even if others find it distasteful. You made an insulting proposition to a married woman in public," Hayes said. "That goes beyond distasteful. That is harassment. And if you continue, I will have grounds to arrest you for disturbing the peace and public nuisance." The crowd reacted with surprised murmurs. Few people expected the sheriff to side so clearly with Silas and Nahimana, especially against a man who had just implied he might bring significant wealth to the town. Several of the business owners in the crowd looked conflicted, clearly torn between their moral discomfort with Blackwell's behavior and their economic interest in his potential investments. Blackwell's face hardened. The mask of friendly businessman fell away completely, revealing something much colder underneath. "You are making a serious mistake, Sheriff," he said quietly. "I have friends in territorial government. I have business relationships with people who can make your life very difficult. Are you really willing to throw away your career to defend these two?" Hayes did not flinch. He had been threatened before by men who thought power meant the ability to hurt others without consequence. "My career is not your concern," Hayes said. "And yes, I am willing to defend any person in my town who is being publicly harassed and threatened. That is what the law requires, what my oath requires." He turned slightly to address Blackwell's two men, who still had their hands near their concealed weapons. "If either of you gentlemen draws a weapon in my town, I will consider it an act of aggression and respond accordingly. I suggest you keep your hands visible and away from those coats." The two men exchanged glances, then slowly moved their hands away from their weapons. Whatever Blackwell was paying them, it clearly was not enough to get into a gunfight with a sheriff in the middle of a crowded street. Blackwell stood very still for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was physically chewing on the words he wanted to say, but knew better than to release. Finally, he turned his attention back to Silas and Nahimana, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with barely controlled rage. "This is not over," he said. "Not even close." He turned and walked back toward his carriage, his two men following behind him like shadows. The crowd parted to let them through, and for a moment it seemed like the situation might actually be resolved without further incident. But then Blackwell stopped halfway to his carriage and turned back one final time. "You should know something," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I did not come to this town by accident." The words hung in the air like a noose waiting to tighten. Blackwell stood with his back to his carriage, that smug expression returning to his face as he watched the confusion spread through the crowd. He had been waiting for this moment, saving it like a card player holds back his best hand until exactly the right time to play it. Silas felt Nahimana tense beside him, not with fear, with recognition. She knew something about what Blackwell was about to say, or at least suspected, and whatever it was made her more guarded than she had been even when holding her knife moments before. 3 months ago, Blackwell began, addressing the crowd as much as Silas and Nahimana, I received a very interesting letter from a business associate in Denver. This associate deals in land acquisitions, property development, the kind of work that requires knowing about opportunities before they become public knowledge. He told me about a ranch here, small operation, modest but well-maintained. Nothing special about it except for one detail. He paused for effect, clearly enjoying the attention. The land it sits on has water rights that make it extraordinarily valuable. There is a spring on that property that feeds into the main water source for 3 neighboring ranches. Whoever controls that spring controls the water supply for a significant portion of grazing land in this area. My associate estimated the property could be worth 50 times what the current owners paid for it. If sold to the right buyer. Silas felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly which ranch Blackwell was describing. His ranch. The land he and Nahimana had purchased 3 years ago with every dollar they had managed to save. They had known about the spring, of course, But they had bought the land to build a life, not to speculate on water rights. I came here to make an offer on that property, Blackwell continued. A very generous offer. More money than most ranchers see in 10 lifetimes. But when I asked around town about the owners, I heard the most fascinating story. About a rancher who had married an Apache woman. About how people in town did not quite know what to make of them. About how they kept to themselves mostly, but when they did come to town, heads turned. He gestured toward Nahimana with an expression that made Silas want to hit him regardless of consequences. I realized this was an opportunity for more than just a land deal. This was a chance to demonstrate something important, to show that no matter how much these people pretend to have dignity and principles, everyone has a price. The land, the woman, the respect, all of it can be bought if you offer enough. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward again, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. You need to leave now, Hayes said. Before this goes somewhere neither of us wants it to go. But Blackwell was not finished. He was the kind of man who needed to have the last word, who needed to make sure everyone understood exactly how clever he thought he was. The offer for the land still stands, he said, looking directly at Silas. $50,000. More money than you will ever see again. You can take it and buy property somewhere else. Somewhere people will not stare at you and your wife every time you walk down the street. Somewhere you can start over without all the judgment and whispers. He smiled then, and it was perhaps the cruelest expression Silas had seen on a human face. Or you can keep your pride and your principles and watch as I buy up every property around yours, as I control the water access for your neighbors, as I make sure that every person in this area knows that the reason their ranches are struggling is because you refuse to sell, because you put your own stubborn pride above the welfare of your community. The threat was clear and brutal. Blackwell was not just trying to buy the land. He was trying to isolate them, to turn their neighbors against them, to make their continued presence so costly to everyone around them that they would have no choice but to leave. Nahimana's hand moved to her belt again, not to the knife but to something else. A small leather cord that Silas recognized as connected to a medicine pouch she wore under her shirt. It was a gesture she made when she was thinking deeply about something, weighing options that had no good outcomes. Silas looked at the faces in the crowd. Some showed sympathy, some showed concern, but others showed something more complicated. They showed calculation. They were doing the math in their heads, wondering if $50,000 was worth standing against, wondering if supporting Silas and Nahimana was worth potentially losing their own water access. You have made your offer, Silas said quietly, and our answer is no. The land is not for sale, not for $50,000, not for any amount. Blackwell's smile widened. Then I suppose we will see how long you can hold on to principles when reality starts to bite. He climbed into his carriage without another word. His two men followed, and within moments the expensive vehicle was rolling away down the street, leaving a cloud of dust and a town full of people who were suddenly looking at Silas and Nahimana very differently than they had an hour before. The sheriff remained standing nearby, his expression troubled. The crowd dispersed slowly, people breaking into small groups to discuss what they had just witnessed. Silas could hear fragments of conversation as people passed, and what he heard made his chest tighten with a different kind of tension than anything Blackwell had created. $50,000 is more money than this whole town sees in a year. If he buys up the surrounding land, we could lose access to water. My cattle would have nowhere to graze. I got nothing against them personally, but is their pride worth everyone else suffering? Sheriff Hayes waited until most of the crowd had moved on before speaking. His voice was low, meant only for Silas and Nahimana to hear. That was well handled, he said. Both of you kept your composure when most people would have lost theirs. But I need you to understand something. Blackwell is not just making threats. Men like him have resources and connections that can make life very difficult. If he starts buying up land around yours, he can legally restrict access in ways that will hurt your neighbors. And when that happens, they will blame you, whether that is fair or not. Silas knew Hayes was right. The sheriff was not trying to pressure them into selling. He was simply stating the reality of their situation. We built that ranch from nothing, Silas said. Every fence post, every building. We cleared rocks from fields until our hands bled. That land is not just property to us. It is proof that we can make a life together despite everyone who said it was impossible. Hayes nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. I know, and I respect that, but respect will not protect you if your neighbors decide you are the reason their livelihoods are threatened. Nahimana had been silent through this exchange, her expression distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice had a quality that Silas recognized as the tone she used when discussing her past, her life before they met. "When I left my tribe to marry Silas," she said, "my mother told me something. She said that living between two worlds means never fully belonging to either, that I would always be too Apache for the settlers and too influenced by settlers for my own people. She said the price of that choice would be loneliness, and I needed to decide if love was worth that cost." She looked at Silas with an expression that held years of shared struggles and small victories. "I told her it was, and I have never regretted that choice, not once, not even now." The three of them stood in the now empty street, the sun having moved enough that shadows were starting to lengthen from the buildings. The heat of the day was beginning to fade, but the heat of the situation they faced was only intensifying. "What will you do?" Hayes asked. "We will go home," Silas said. "We will take care of our animals. We will maintain our land, and we will wait to see what Blackwell does next, because giving in to threats is not an option, not for us." Hayes looked like he wanted to say more, to offer advice or warnings, but he seemed to recognize that some decisions were already made, and no amount of practical wisdom would change them. He simply nodded and walked back toward his office, leaving Silas and Nahimana alone on the street. They gathered their supplies from the general store, neither speaking as they loaded everything onto their wagon. The shopkeeper had been apologetic, almost embarrassed, as he helped them, clearly uncomfortable with the position they were now in, but not brave enough to say anything supportive in case it hurt his business. As they prepared to leave town, a man approached them. He was older, probably in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his entire life working outdoors. Silas recognized him as Calvin Briggs, who owned a ranch about 5 miles from theirs. "I need to speak with you," Briggs said without preamble. His tone was not hostile, but it was not friendly either. "About this water situation." Nahimana looked at the man with the same steady gaze she had given Blackwell, though without the anger. She was simply assessing, trying to determine whether he was a threat or simply someone caught in an impossible situation. "We did not create this problem," Silas said carefully. "Blackwell did. We are just trying to live our lives." "I understand that," Briggs said. "But understanding does not change the fact that my livelihood depends on water access that apparently flows through your land. If Blackwell starts buying up property and restricting usage, my ranch dies. My family loses everything. And while I got no personal issue with you two, I need to know if you have considered what your refusal to sell might cost the rest of us." The question hung between them, heavy with implications, because that was the real cruelty of what Blackwell had done. He had not just threatened Silas and Nahimana, he had turned them into a problem for everyone else, had made their neighbors view them not as fellow ranchers, but as obstacles to survival. "We have considered it," Nahimana said quietly, "and we have decided that some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is high." Briggs looked at them for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "I hope you are right about that, because if you are wrong, a lot of innocent people are going to pay the price." He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving them with the crushing weight of knowing that this fight was no longer just about their own dignity. It was about to become something much larger. 3 days after the confrontation with Blackwell, Silas and Nahimana rode back into town, but this time they were not alone. Calvin Briggs rode beside them, along with 4 other ranchers whose properties bordered theirs or depended on the same water sources. They had spent those 3 days visiting every neighbor, having difficult conversations, and proposing something that had never been done in that area before. They gathered in the church at the edge of town, the only building large enough to hold everyone who needed to be part of this discussion. Sheriff Hayes was there, so were most of the business owners. Even some people who had no direct stake in the water rights came, sensing that what happened today would define the character of their community for years to come. Silas stood at the front of the room, Nahimana beside him. He held a stack of papers that had taken him 2 days to write and 1 day to have reviewed by the one lawyer in town who was willing to help them. "We have spent the last 3 days talking to our neighbors," Silas began, "listening to their concerns, understanding that our decision affects more than just us, and we have come up with a solution." He held up the papers so everyone could see. "These are water rights agreements. Legal documents that grant permanent, irrevocable access to the spring on our property, to every rancher whose land borders ours or depends on that water source. Free of charge, no conditions, no fees. The water that flows through our land will be shared equally with everyone who needs it. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Calvin Briggs stood up from his seat. "We have already signed," Briggs said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Silas and Nahimana brought these agreements to each of us. They sat in our homes and listened to our fears about what Blackwell might do. And then they offered us something that solved the entire problem. Not for money, not for favors, just because it was the right thing to do." Nahimana stepped forward, and the room quieted immediately. She had that effect on people. When she spoke, you listened. "In my tribe, water belongs to everyone," she said. "It is not something that can be owned by one person or sold for profit. It flows where it flows, and those who need it share it. When Silas and I bought this land, we never intended to control the water. We just wanted a place to build our life. So this agreement simply puts into legal terms what we already believed. That water is for everyone who needs it." The implications were sinking in now. If the water rights were already distributed to all the neighboring ranches through legal agreements, then Blackwell had nothing to leverage. He could buy surrounding properties, but he could not control the water. The strategic value he had been counting on had just evaporated. Someone in the back of the room started clapping, then another person joined. Within moments, the entire room was applauding, not just for the practical solution, but for what it represented. A refusal to let outside pressure destroy their community. A choice to solve problems together rather than let fear divide them. The church doors opened, and Cornelius Blackwell walked in. He had clearly heard about the meeting and come to see what was happening. His expensive suit looked out of place among the working clothes of the ranchers, and his expression suggested he already understood what had occurred. "Very clever," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You have given away the one thing that made your property valuable, destroyed your own leverage." "We did not give anything away," Silas said calmly. "We shared something that was never ours alone to begin with." Blackwell looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. There was no fear there anymore, no uncertainty, just a quiet confidence that came from people who had solved their problem without him. "You have made a mistake," Blackwell said. "All of you. I could still buy this entire area. Make your lives difficult in ways you cannot imagine." Sheriff Hayes stood up from his seat near the back. "Or you could leave," Hayes said, "because you have lost. Not just the water rights, not just the business opportunity. You have lost any chance of being welcome in this town. We do not need your money or your threats. We take care of our own." Blackwell stood there for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was physically trying to chew through his rage. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. His footsteps echoed in the silent church until the doors closed behind him. The tension that had gripped the room for days finally broke. People stood and shook hands with Silas and Nahimana, offering congratulations and apologies for ever doubting them. Calvin Briggs pulled Silas into a rough embrace that spoke of respect earned through action rather than words. Nahimana caught Silas's eye across the crowd, and he saw in her expression the same thing he felt. They had not just saved their ranch, they had proven that dignity and principle could stand against wealth and power, that a community united was stronger than any individual threat. That love and respect were worth fighting for, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. The ranch was still theirs. The water would flow freely, and somewhere down that dusty road, a man in an expensive suit was learning that not everything could be bought. Some lessons cost more than money, and some values were worth more than any price. If you enjoyed this story of dignity and courage in the Old West, click the video on your screen right now to watch another tale of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges in the untamed frontier. Stories where character matters more than wealth, and where standing up for what is right changes everything. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss these powerful Western narratives that remind us what true strength really means. Hit that button now, because the next story is waiting, and it is one you will not want to miss.